you're here to listen to a session on how to master the art of L&D content curation. Very important piece. Joining me, I'm Kelly, I'm the Sales Development Manager for Go1 for EMEA, is the wonderful Amanda Nolan, co-founder of Niles Nolan, which is an expert-led consultancy business. We've also got Sebastian Tyndall from Vitality. He's Director of L&D Operations, and Josh, Director of Digital Learning at Warner Music. Thank you so much for joining us today. A little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Here we go. So before we get started, this is very much a two-way conversation piece today. So we absolutely encourage audience participation, whether that is in person or online. Feel free to scan the QR code to get involved. There's a poll at the end of this as well. But if you do have any questions throughout, please do either raise your hand, or do the necessary online, and we will come to your questions. Okay, so without further ado, I will pass over to Amanda to get the session started.
Great.
Thanks, Amanda.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I know this is kind of the graveyard shift with this heat at 3 p.m., so thank you for that. I think I brought the heat with me from Spain, where I'm based. In Madrid, it was 40 degrees on Monday. I know, so this feels like spring. Anyways, looking forward to this conversation about a subject near and dear to my heart, which is content curation. But actually, I'm going to be a bit tricky because we're going to stretch ourselves a bit and talk about the why behind the curation, which is something that I like to call right skilling, and really getting to the what for behind the learning that we're doing. So the pandemic, we're still talking about the pandemic. But the reason I wanted to insist on bringing this up is it really did accelerate a trend that was already happening, where the half-life of skills is shrinking, and I know you've read plenty of studies. I don't need to quote any of them or repeat any of them to convince you. But as that happened, we've seen a lot of people moving around in jobs and roles, and really, in different skills. So my question for you is, as L&D leaders and experts that you are, what do you think that we got right? Right, Josh? What do you think we got right, and what did we maybe get not so right when it came to helping facilitate this shift?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one for us. So I, as you know, Amanda, I joined Warner Music as kind of employee one of lockdown, really. So yeah. I was really the guinea pig for that whole thing, and coming up with a digital learning strategy in that space from kind of ground upwards, we needed to make sure we were having enough content that we could do meaningful curation off of, as well as providing that kind of buffet approach, so that if someone comes to us and says, I need to learn the latest Python skills and things like that, we're not having to look at, oh my God, how do I pull in a facilitator? Okay. We've got travel costs and lunch costs and all this sort of stuff. During a pandemic, simply not going to happen. So what can we offer that means that someone isn't just completely cut off of any sort of learning development offering? And for us, it was really baby steps there, but we've kind of done it in a way that I think has kind of hurdled a number of the pieces that larger organizations have.
Mm-hmm. And Sebastian, what would you maybe say that we didn't really get right when it came to scrambling to get everything online and move to digital during the pandemic?
Just that scrambling to get things online. I think some organizations seem to adapt really well and chose that they were going to follow this as a long-term approach. It wasn't survival. We weren't just trying to put things online for 6 months and see what happens at the next government announcement. The world was fundamentally changed. And I think the ones that adapted the best to that made that clear delineation between synchronous and asynchronous learning. Mm-hmm. They didn't just talk about Zoom sessions for individuals. And isn't this brilliant? Everyone's doing it at home, and we've adapted so well. I think the organisations that understood that fundamentally where you work and your proximity to your colleagues is irrevocably changed, mm-hmm. they've really embraced to come out of the pandemic to be better positioned than some of their colleagues.
That's a really interesting point. Is that what you're seeing with the many customers that you work with? Where you think that they might have some room for improvement?
I think pre-pandemic we saw a big spike, obviously predominantly in compliance, and then
mm-hmm.
pandemic hit and there was the complete shift to soft skills. And those businesses that did best in that time mm-hmm. are the ones with the digital agility to do so. Mm-hmm. And that came from agility from a senior leadership perspective, the buy-in to learning, but having that infrastructure in place, and certainly moving forwards now, the bit that the organizations that got it right were the ones who could adapt quickly and saw the need. And like you said, the synchronous and asynchronous learning was a big component part of really driving that learning home. And certainly now moving forwards, that's what we're seeing more and more, and it seems to become absolutely the norm. So the organizations who are doing that, it seems to be the ones who are succeeding in terms of retaining talent.
So it sounds like during the pandemic, we have come a long way when it comes to really, establishing that scaffolding, if you will, some of the infrastructure and some of the practices. But really, when we talk about learning, we can't talk about developing skills and learning without thinking of culture. And this is just one study from LinkedIn, but the 5 great drivers of workforce culture, one of the top ones is providing learning and development opportunities for people. Yay! So that means we might still have a job despite the recession, right? But when you think about it, the question is, just because people are happy, right, and on those happy sheets that we love to use, and they are very keen on learning and development, is that good enough? Just because they're engaged with the idea of learning?
I don't personally think so, because I think we've all been in the space where we've seen just learning development for the sake of learning development. We've seen several big profile companies just simply cut the whole thing off quite recently. So that can be quite a scary world to exist in. So for me, it's about that meaningfulness, and going back to kind of these drivers here, I think underpinning all of them is kind of a central goal for an organization. Like we talk about opportunities to grow. Well, that needs a focus, that needs a direction. We talk about belonging, values, all this sort of stuff. It all compiles under this one umbrella. And for me, that is what a lot of organizations need to really look at their mission statements, both externally and internally. And you've got to live and breathe that DNA. And if your learning's not in support of that, then you need to really rethink it.
Yeah.
So it sounds like we're really starting to think now. We've got the scaffolding. We're more comfortable with digital. Even, my rather elderly parents, although they would kill me if they were listening to me say that, are happy to be on Zoom and on FaceTime, and they're used to these technologies. All of this is good. So habits have changed. But it's really about the why, isn't it? It's about upskilling with purpose, about being much more deliberate and guided in how we do this. So we're going to try one of these polls, and hopefully your apps are working. I know I had some issues with mine this morning. But in a word, if you will, how would you describe the upskilling strategy in your organizations? And if you don't have the app, at least just think about it.
We kind of need a countdown clock or something, don't we, really?
Just a few moments, right? And while they're thinking about this and figuring out the app, Sebastian, at your organization, how would you describe the upskilling strategy at Vitality?
People will learn the most from experience. And what we've seen is a lot of companies say that by having a pool of role agnostic content, you can guide your way to a particular role, and that will be fantastic. But more people will be disappointed by the lack of opportunities than there will be the ones that are actually rewarded with one. So it becomes the booby prize. You didn't get a job, but you can have a course.
So can you sum that all up in one word?
Experiential.
Experiential.
And cheap. No,
oh, and cheap. Are those two things compatible? No, sure.
I think they're mutually exclusive.
Right. So I only see one word popping up on the screen so far, unless there's something I can't see.
Now, we did ask for honesty.
Yes. So don't be shy. At least have a couple more words, so we'll give you another moment. Yeah? All right. Can we see the results of that?
Sketchy.
Okay.
I like that.
Sketchy. That's scary. Whoever said sketchy is definitely wins the tedious.
Oh.
Your upskilling strategy is tedious. I'm curious if that's from the perspective of the L&D person trying to do it, or tedious from the learner perspective, right? And changing. Okay, so I think change, these days it is a constant. The common denominator there, it sounds hard, right? So upskilling, the thing is, it's hard. And so when we think about content, and I love the fact that Go One gave me, I'm not on a leash here. They let me talk about anything I want. We're talking about curation and cutting through the noise of content. And really, the thing is, there is no silver bullet, right? And so curation does not magically happen. And especially if we're thinking about deliberate right skilling, it's hard work. So hopefully some of the ideas that we've shared today up here will help you take something back to your organizations that you can apply and with baby steps get closer to that target. So another poll I have for you actually is, I'm curious, what is your relationship within this? Because you can't think about upskilling and reskilling without really connecting learning and development with the talent side of things, right? With the what for. So I'm just wondering, in your organizations, what is your relationship like? Are you completely joined up? You're, joined at the hip and fully integrated and coordinated? Or is it something a bit different? So if you have your apps open, you get to vote again. This is all about participation. You might get some socks at the end if you actually play nicely. Or a candle. Did you get I got socks. They're really nice.
I got nothing.
Yeah.
No.
So what is the relationship with talent like in your org? Do you work together?
Yeah, increasingly collaborative. I think we've realized that you cannot delineate the two, and we're seeing blurred lines between a lot of people functions. So we understand that where there are challenges sometimes acquiring the staff that you want, obviously you have the options, you can build, you can borrow, etc., etc. But we understand that there's a slightly more holistic approach required here, where we have to make sure that we are helping them to fill the right gaps, both internally and externally in the organisation. And it's been incredibly beneficial, and I think the conversations importantly have moved past platforms and software and moved much more to experiential strategy.
Okay, so you are talking to each other. This is a good thing.
Yes.
This is a good thing. I mean, you don't need to share any dirty secrets here, but is that what you're seeing in the companies that you are helping steer in the right direction? Is learning existing in a bubble, or are they really starting to talk more with talent about the why and why are we doing the upskilling?
I mean, the why question is so important, and yes is the answer, but certainly when we initially speak to customers, even still, there isn't that synergy between talent and L&D, and in an ideal world, absolutely, to mobilize internal talent, we have to develop them, etc. So absolutely intrinsic part of what we do at Go1 is enable that process to sort of bring those teams together and those business functions to better the employees within the organization, and of course develops the organization as a whole in any event. So yeah, it's definitely the move that we're seeing more, but I think there are certain businesses that need a bit of hand holding on that journey. Okay. But it's great to hear, Seb, that you're
great. So we see the donut again. So, and I think this is good news, unless nobody's voting, because one of the options certainly was we never talk to each other, right? And sadly, I have to say, because with the business I have, I work across sectors, across geographies, and what I see is 8 or 9 times out of 10, really, it's more like, let's see if I can advance to the next slide.
Oh,
Josh?
They've moved it down here.
Oh, we've got a few more moments. There we go. So what I typically do see in organizations is it's not joined up. And when you think of HR, and this conference spans both L&D and HR, you've got all of these functions which are still very, very much siloed. Even L&D and leadership development are typically very separate things. And so it's something to start thinking about. If you want to get upskilling and reskilling right, what is your relationship with talent management? And the thing is, it's a really important driver when it comes to employee retention and attraction to begin with, because the companies that do work together with talent and have a strategy for internal mobility, in fact, they stay almost twice as long as the ones that don't. So just some food for thought there. So what a piece of advice for our friends here, if you were to start, if they haven't started yet, really thinking about a deliberate upskilling and reskilling strategy, where would you say they should start? Either one of you.
I think for me it starts with the talent lifecycle, because talking about the links between L&D and talent in total, L&D should be a key enabler of the various stages of the talent lifecycle. So if you're not plugged into that, or you don't even have a view of that, I would say that would be a fundamental piece to start. There's obviously some very basics like your onboarding and your exiting to start with, but that can look very different for different organizations depending on what your kind of internal philosophy is to recruit internally or externally. It can look as a whole different thing, and unless those things start singing on the same sheet, it's always going to feel disconnected from the employee experience. It's always going to feel like just a sidebar thing, really.
Right. And the fact is, it's really getting harder. We were talking about the skills gap at the beginning of our chat. It's getting harder and harder to find the skills on the market that our organizations need to stay competitive and succeed. And so, how do we make this a priority? What would you advise your clients?
I think in terms of kind of skills more generally being a priority, I think the optics between the two teams is absolutely crucial, and I completely agree with that. I think having access to resource is obviously absolutely key in terms of what we do. But predominantly, I would say that the optics are the best place to start, and then move forward from there. Unless you have that, I think fundamentally the foundation is rocky.
Yeah, that's really good advice. One very tangible piece of advice that I would have is don't boil the ocean. Don't try to do it all at once. Don't spend 3 years building some kind of competency framework or a skills ontology or whatever the flavor of the day is in the new jargon. Really try to start with a tangible need that you have in your business. So I'll give you an example. You might think job postings, right? So go to your talent function or and think about what are the job postings that have been up there for maybe 6 weeks that your organization is struggling to fill. And they can't find talent externally on the marketplace. And then maybe suggest, hey, well, why don't we go have a coffee and come up with a plan to grow those skills internally? Okay, so that's just an example of how you might be more joined up, rather than just throwing content on a problem that you don't even know exists. Yeah, but when you do that, be careful, because skills are not money in the bank, as I like to say. So all of this talk about, I think it's very exciting, the opportunities here for internal talent mobility and upskilling and reskilling and moving people around. But the problem is people are not widgets, are they? They're not, you can't just assume, oh, well, these people have these skills, my organization needs those skills, so therefore I'm going to move them around. There's a thing called motivation, right? There's definitely a thing called motivation. And if you don't think about the skills that I want to learn, then really that whole equation doesn't work. So when it comes to curating, right, because that in theory is what we're talking about today, curating content, first of all, key point is what is the actual need? What is the actual business need? Where are the critical gaps? And then reverse engineer from there, right? But can you share maybe some best practices, things that you've had success with, where you really are aligning content from a content aggregator, for example, or a library, or maybe that you built in-house, against those needs that you have in the organization? How can you even begin to do that at scale? It's not easy, eh?
My recommendation would be not to start with today's problems. A lot of people in organizations will say that we're struggling with this skill, so let's get around the table and fix it. I wouldn't depart from that assumption. I would say, look, the half-life of skills is diminishing. The half-life of an engineering degree is less than 3 years, which was the first time you can say that in 50 years.
Yep.
So we actually know that sometimes cultivating some of these skills and going through an extrinsic cost to do it will be a waste of money. So you have to sit there as an organization and say, what skills are going to be the absolutely most fundamental to our success in 5 to 7 years' time? I'm picking in those years at random. Obviously, some people might go further in advance. But the reality is you're trying to do this for the future and not for today's issues. A lot of people talk about scarce skills and say all businesses are struggling with scarce skills. That's scarcity principle. That's the whole point. That's the reason why they're scarce. So either you can go after those skills today, knowing that they'll be more expensive than they potentially should be, or you could start growing tomorrow to get ahead of that economic curve, and that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, it really is getting to a critical point. So some technical skills, for example, literally the life of that skill is now 2.5 years. So that might mean that you have someone at university that's learning, I don't know, Python or some coding language, and before they even graduate from university, that skill is obsolete. So just think of the ramifications. So really good point. Think you've got to be looking around the corner. And that's scary, because it's hard to even know what skill gaps we have today, let alone where are we going to be hurting in the future. So would you recommend, for example, Josh, looking at places like the World Economic Forum, these lists of future skills, you know the typical list, right, with resilience and communication and things like that. Is that a good place to start, do you think?
I think it can be. I mean, for me, I'm one of these people that never really came through kind of formal education and things like that. So for me, a vast majority of how I've learned is through networking, through connections, and through kind of that peer-to-peer sharing. I think that is a crucial piece. And going back to what kind of Sebastian said earlier, a future skill for me, and also Kelly mentioned, it's going to be on the softer side, because the technical skills have such a shelf life. But you know what doesn't? Curiosity, willingness to upskill, vision, that sort of stuff, that's always going to kind of stick around. And these are going to be the people to help you forecast the technical skills.
I agree and I disagree, and I'm going to go to the next slide and you'll see why. So spray and pray, that approach, I believe it really doesn't work. And so we think about throwing content against problems. So even if it's true, we want to build for, I don't know, communication. Just buying content libraries alone, and they can definitely be part of the solution, but just doing that and throwing content against people does not skills develop, right? Because number one, it's usually, you know, a smorgasbord approach of just randomly, more is more, but at the same time, it's not targeted enough. And so it's just really to think about, you do need to align content with that, but then also build opportunities for things like practice, to your point, feedback, coaching and mentoring, all of those things. It's not just about these content assets alone. So really to think about that holistically, I think is important, yeah?
I will just add to that though, I think, Josh's point, anyone who tells you what will be an important skill in 5 years' time is a liar. They don't know. A lot of people at the conference will tell you they all know what it is. They don't. So all of this stuff is best case scenario. So you know the empirical sources in your organization, and whether you like the answer or not, some of it will be speculative. In fact, all of it will be speculative. So I think it's okay sometimes to go with as much information as you got as you have at that particular time.
Make a hypothesis and run with it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
That's got to be it. Test and learn. That approach is so crucial.
Absolutely. Start with an MVP, start with a hypothesis and see if it works. I think often as well, and this could be a whole other chat, which we don't have time for today, but don't just make assumptions. And so once you put something out into the world, you know, on your platform or what have you, measure it. Are people using it? Are they engaged? And ideally, is it driving some kind of business performance, right? And people performance or not. And if it's not, you might need to pull it out and change it. It could be something as simple as, oh, it didn't have a good title, you know, or it just wasn't relevant for the person, or maybe it was downright bad. But really, always be reading the data to make sure that you're not assuming.
Yeah,
Massively.
What kind of advice do you give Go1 customers around curation? Because I know you have a team of people that help them, so if they need to curate at scale, you can do some of the heavy lifting.
Absolutely, and I think to your point, spray and pray absolutely doesn't work.
Yeah.
I think absolutely, Josh, you're right from a human skill perspective. I do think if we're looking at future skills, it's a good place to place a bet in terms of kind of where we're going, and that ability to be human and have those human skills is going to be really what sets organizations apart as we get more and more embedded into AI and the tech revolution. But in terms of content, too much content is actually no good for anybody. It's overwhelming. Certainly from an L&D function perspective, you simply don't have the time. We have over 100,000 courses. That's depth and breadth, absolutely. So yes, we can focus on lots of different business departments and teams, but to have that and to go through that yourselves is completely a pointless and a waste of your time. So in order to make the most out of that, we see ourselves, yes, we're a content aggregator, but actually we're an ongoing content curation platform. And that's what we are. That's what our expertise. And in order to be able to kind of share with you not only what works in your organizations, what works for you as you know, but what's working for our wider ecosystem with our other customers, perhaps in your industries, perhaps not, we can then help inform your decision as well based on, you know, real-time data. So the peer-to-peer point, I think, is important because we can give you that as well.
And we were talking about opportunities for practice because you have the content assets on the one hand, but then how do you weave, if you're doing this at all, how do you weave these other things into a more holistic learning experience? Have you had any experience or success with that at Warner?
I mean, I think what you were talking about earlier on, so your mentoring, your coaching, your job shadowing, all of them are incredibly crucial because, as you said, like, we can curate things all day and all night, but unless we're actually giving those people to apply those practical skills at kind of time and place and learn from people as well in those roles, it's never going to go anywhere because someone can sit there and know the theory, but if they're never actually getting in the car to drive, it's completely wasted knowledge.
Yeah. I always like to use the analogy of a brain surgeon, right? So if I needed to have brain surgery, what would I prefer? Someone who had watched a bunch of videos on TikTok or YouTube and, you know, had consumed all of these beautiful modules on a platform, right? But
I'm sure there's probably a VR module now.
I'm sure, right?
So much better, wouldn't it?
You know, how to open up a cranium and, you know, et cetera. Or would you rather someone who had never done any of that, never even cracked open a textbook, but they had learned from a mentor in an operating theater and maybe actually tried to do it a bit? I certainly know which one I would trust with my brain. If I had, ideally, it's going to be a mix of those two things. Yes. But it's another thing to think about. It's not just throwing content on the problem. You have to curate the entire experience. Yeah. So technology, and you mentioned a car a minute ago, so you didn't know that was coming, did you, Josh? But why a race car? So I think we're all lovers of technology up here. Some of us work for technology companies, others are just, geeks and ex-gamers. So I do believe in the power of technology to help facilitate this and really, to take us to the next level. But probably the technology is 5% of any transformation that you're going to want to achieve. And lots of my customers come to me and say, I want to buy an LXP, and I want to buy this, and another platform, and another platform. And I'm like, whoa, what are you buying that for? And what about the rest? Things like content strategy, yeah? So from a tech perspective, where do you think it can help us and maybe not help us? So where is it a good idea to not try to technologize the problem?
So I think when we're talking about the culture of an organization, Vitality, and I speak very highly of the organization there, it's very much a place where if it's at all possible, you can learn your experience in the role. And it is a forgiving environment to do that, and people are supported.
Yep.
Those elements and those empathetic elements for organization are absolutely critical. The way in which you can utilize platforms and technology, I think, is to harness the right data to be able to identify those people that are not likely to put their hand up, that don't know about some of these opportunities across your organization, that have brilliant skills that you're not leveraging at that time. There are fantastic qualifications and skills that you can find everywhere, particularly in frontline roles. We discovered that, I think it was about last time we're checking, over 60% of people in our contact centre had a degree. Not that that's critical, but some of these are first-class mathematics degrees from Oxbridge, which is what our data science team goes scouring the globe for. It's right in front of you. So we can find a lot of time with internal mobility platforms, with what people are studying in their spare time, obviously through aggregators like Go1, that you can identify some real quality people that aren't just the ones that put their hand up and say, I'm ready for it. Some people don't know they're ready for it. It's your responsibility to help them.
No, absolutely. Just something as simply as finding the right people and the right skills in the organization is something that technology can probably help with.
I was just going to say and add to that, I think, and those people who are doing that from a self-directed perspective as well, often highlight there that, there's aspirations and certainly perhaps even future leaders.
Yes, agree.
I think one thing to add, just kind of peeling back to more the tech and the underlying pieces.
I knew you'd bring it back to the tech,
I love the
Josh.
race car analogy because if we simply look at the race car, you've got Michelin tires connected to a bonnet that's made by a different person, connected to screens that are made by a different person, to a helmet that's made by a different person. But you know what it is? It's all interconnected. It's all been tested. It's all focused on the cutting edge experience, best in breed for everything. You don't see any generalist stuff going on in that world. Why do we do it in the HR world?
Yeah,
steal that one.
All about the ecosystem, right?
Exactly.
But specifically, bringing it back to curation, where can technology help with that and take some of the pain away? Have you had any experiences there?
I think for me, one of the big things we've kind of had, especially in the music industry, as you can imagine, we've had things like NFTs and metaverse and all of that sort of stuff really kind of make a huge impact in our world. And for us, as you can imagine, L&D is always on the back foot with that sort of stuff. How are we meant to predict this sort of stuff is coming in? But you know what? We have people in our organization, and using our technology, we've been able to identify who are those people that are perhaps leading our own thinking in this place. So who's the person taking Ed Sheeran merchandise and selling it into Fortnite to 7-year-olds all around the world? These are the people we need to essentially bottle and curate their knowledge and have that pushed out to the organization. It doesn't matter if it's got an L&D stamp on it, but if it has that person's stamp on it, that's going to be taken by really kind of seriously in the organization.
Kind of to your point before, it is really about locating the talent and the skills. But I think too with curation, AI can go a long way. And you've got to buyer beware with the AI promises out here with some of these vendors. But really, if it's done well, it can help with the relevance problem, right? And finding the right stuff and getting it to the right people. There's a partner, I think, of Go1, which is Filter, that has a great tool called Content Intelligence that does just that, for example. So technology, if you choose it for the right purposes and not just tech for the sake of tech, it is our friend, right? Good. So bringing it back to the pandemic, everybody's talking the great resignation, the great reshuffle, or is it going to be the great regret? So just to leave you with the thought of, what's one thing that you think that we can all do to really make sure that we seize the opportunity presented by the pandemic and not regress back, especially now that budget cuts might be pending? What do you think, Sebastian?
Yeah, okay. I think it's not it's not a resignation, it's a migration. These people are going somewhere. The unemployment rate hasn't fallen. The number of jobs available have never been higher. People are going to other organizations for a reason. I would go and find out why that is. And not blame it on a pandemic.
Okay.
I'd agree completely. Your external perception of an organization is crucial. Like, simply being an organization that is fostering and showing that they are willing to have their people take risks, try new experiments, things like that. That's the sort of stuff that would get any competent person moving. You'll get them saying, I have a chance to try something new in a different organization. That's going to snatch everyone up overnight. So for me, it's that experimentation culture. But for that, it's got to be transparent.
Excellent. Any further thoughts to add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, I think that it comes back again to digital agility in the organization and learning and development agility. And if you have the tools and the resource to be able to support people who have those aspirations or desires or an itch to scratch, that's obviously been implemented since COVID now, and continue to build on that with the right curation beside, then you put yourself in a really great position, regardless of whether it's a resignation, reshuffle, or regret.
Excellent. And one last piece of advice that I'll give you is, when it comes to curation, lean on your partners, lean on your vendors. It is really hard to do all that heavy lifting at scale. Even these big organizations that I typically work with, they just don't have the bandwidth. So ask them for help. People like Go On, they care about this. That's why we're here. See what they can do for you, so you can really have sort of an augmented team and get closer to that goal. Wonderful.
Just takes a second.
I think that is all we've got. That's up to the... Sorry? Yeah, if anyone has any questions, we can definitely stick around for a little while.
If not, I'm seeing some champagne glasses.
Yeah, it's almost like
hanging around for a little bit.
They started early with the cocktail hour.
Hard
Hard to compete with that. Or if you don't want to do it also in front of everyone, we can hang around here if you have any questions. Great. Well, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much.